All right, here we go. James 1. So last week we did our intro and discussed and debated who James is. We still don't really know for sure. So we'll put some of those contexts into action as we go through the chapter. But the most likely scenarios of who he is the brother of Jesus. That's the most likely scenario. Possibly also one of the 12, but that's been highly debated for, like we said, for 2,000 years now. We don't know for sure, but most all sources are pretty undisputed that he is the half-brother of Jesus, one of the four brothers. So that's at least who he is. And he opens up James chapter 1, verse 1, saying, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting. So that's his opening statement and pitch. That's the entirety of verse 1. So we know he's identifying himself as a servant of God, and this is being written to the 12 tribes which were scattered abroad. Now, does anybody know when the book of James was written?
I feel like it was really early.
It was fairly early.
Yeah.
Putting into context that the 12 tribes, meaning Jews, right, are scattered. Okay, who caused the Jews to become scattered? Or at least believing Jews, those who believed in the Messiah. Who caused the scattering of all this to take place?
You say the ones that believed in
Yeah, the ones that
Jesus.
believed in Jesus. Because this is who it's being written
The
to.
crucifixion. It's 'cause they were concerned for their life by Saul.
By Saul,
Yeah.
exactly. So in the book of Acts, which we just finished, Paul started out as Saul, and he was the one, as he even said, I wreaked havoc on the church.
Yeah.
So that occurred after the crucifixion, probably within the next 10 to 20 years especially, it started ramping up. So the dates that I have found place this being written anywhere between 45 and 52. So somewhere around year 50. So this would be about 20 years after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And that's about the time Saul was wreaking havoc on the church and just sending people out all over the place, trying to persecute them and kill them because they were believers in Jesus. Of course, he got converted, and we read his whole story in the book of Acts. And then everybody started going after him. So he's this person, James, which we believe to be the brother of Jesus, was writing to these people as this was happening. You know, as Saul was still Saul and becoming Paul, and the persecution was running rampant. This is when this book was written. One of the things that I picked up quickly on the book of James, and has been my impression for years. He is very, very much about walking the talk, about demonstrating evidence behind what you say about yourself. And I try to reflect on that and put that in context of, he talks a lot about it, basically every chapter, of if you say you're a Christian, you need to act like one, you need to look like one, you need to be one. And if you put that in context of him being the half-brother of Jesus, I just kind of wonder where he fell personally in that. How long was he an unbeliever? Because we do know, based on John, it says that neither did his brethren believe in him. We don't know how long that was. We don't know which brothers, if it was all brothers. But at some point, at least some of the brothers didn't believe in Jesus. And I kind of wonder where he falls in that. How long did it take him? Because his book is very stern on, you better prove it through the way you live. And of course, who better to say that than someone who watched Jesus their entire life? We know Jesus did what he said because he was God. So I don't know if a lot of this comes from his observation of Jesus, saying that's the standard, or if some of this was a moment in his life where he was very suspect to the whole thing for a certain period of time, and then it became super real to him, which would have been, if we go with a traditional line of thinking, would have been after the resurrection, right? So if this was written around 50, the resurrection occurred 33, we're looking at, 18 years of time. So perhaps his perspective became real just within the last 18 years before he wrote this. Now I just try to like to get in the head of the writer. I'm kind of curious about when these theologies settled into his brain to the degree that they did, because he's very, very blunt. He's very forward about things. He's very it takes kind of a thick-skinned person to read book of James and hear what he says without getting offended, because he just kind of throws it out there. What do y'all think about maybe some of that context? How are you, Lisa?
Thank you.
Good to see you. Those are the things we don't really think about when we read the Bible: is who wrote it, what did they live through, what was their life like. We get God moved, told them what to write, but there's still a lot of stuff, I'm sure, that affected what they wrote down or how they wrote it down based on their own experience. Luke gave us a completely different account than Matthew, because of their personal viewpoints and experiences. It wasn't their opinion, but they're still, God used their experiences in life maybe to flavor it a certain way. I don't know. What do y'all think about any of that?
Well, I was thinking, maybe not rightfully so, that all of that was resolved prior to him coming out, I guess. I'm not saying, I assumed he knew before he went active in his ministry, meaning those 3 years or 3.5 years, right?
Right.
But I don't know. Are you saying that you don't think he resolved all that? You don't know.
I'm just throwing a question out there.
Okay.
I mean, it seems to me through his writing that he was very solid on all of this.
Yeah.
I just wonder at which point in his life that occurred. Was it very early on, and that's why, if he was one of the 12 disciples, that's why he joined up, because he was already solid? Or maybe he was curious, and those 3 years solidified it, and then the next 20 years of his life before he wrote this, after seeing the aftermath of the resurrection and then the persecution, that it just became more solidified over those 20 years.
I don't think there's any doubt that would have had an impact on their life. But to
Right.
me, when you think about, or when I think of Jews, and they were always looking to, and once they realized that he was the Christ, he was the prophecy that answered to all the prophecies, that's immediate. I mean, you're on board.
Right,
You know?
right. That would be my assumption.
Yeah.
It certainly would be for me.
Yeah.
If I wasn't there already. So that, again, that's kind of who he is, maybe his little background, not totally sure, but some neat things to think about.
Mhm.
And he enters into this by immediately addressing trials. Because again, who's he writing to? He's writing to people being scattered abroad, people who are believing in Jesus, and they're running for their lives, many of them. They're running out of fear, they're not sure kind of where to go, what to do. And he goes straight into it by saying, my brethren. So we take in context that all the people he's writing to are believers. That's what we consider to be the brethren in the Bible. And he says a very weird thing. He says, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. Now that word temptations, depending on the version that you read, is sometimes translated as trials. So, and I think both could be one and the same. Because when we go through trials, who in here has been through a trial? Right? We've been through trials in our lives. When we go through trials, who has been tempted to fail in their faith. You know, we've been tempted to even say, well, I just question the whole thing. You know, or we're tempted when we go through something difficult to say, why am I even trying so hard to live so righteously? When these things just keep happening to me over and over and over again. And you, through the trial, kind of face temptations. So I think the word temptations is significant here, in that usually is the end result of the trial. Now the purpose of the trial, we're going to find out, is the opposite, is to strengthen our faith. But many times as people go through trials, they are tempted to allow their faith to falter and let failure creep in instead. But this is what he says about it. It says, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations or trials, knowing this, that the trying of your faith, because that's what the trial and the temptation is all about, the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. So how can going through a trial build up patience in our lives? Let's think of some examples of how going through a trial, because he says the trying of your faith, which to me puts in context what he's talking about for the temptation/trials, is those are things that are potentially going to affect our faith, as I mentioned. He says the trying of your faith works patience. How can we apply that, and what's a good example of how the trying of your faith can create patience in you? Joy, you should know, for a year or more, this whole thing with finding a boyfriend and all this sort of stuff, you went through a lot of trials, a lot of no-goes.
Well,
And what do we keep telling you through it all? Be
Just
patient.
be patient. Well, for me, like, I just kind of, I didn't lose patience, but I just kind of gave up on, like, being so eager to find somebody. I just...
It made you patient.
Yeah.
You
yeah.
were no longer eager to find something.
Yeah.
You were
It happens
settling
when
into,
you're-
well, it'll happen when it needs to happen. That
Yeah.
is patience.
Yeah, it happens when you're, like, done being eager over, like, and it's like, I was eager to
Right.
find somebody for so long, and it finally did happen when I was just
When you're not.
tired
Yeah.
of being, like, impatient, basically.
Exactly. So that's one example, you know, relationally, that can happen. Looking for a job, maybe a career, maybe waiting on, you know, I know a lot of people who I've talked to here in this church who are older than me, and like, well, our kids have drifted away from the faith, and there's a lot of
I was getting ready to
patience,
say that.
a lot of patience involved with that.
Yes, and even growing through their childhood where they may be tempted. I mean, it's like
Right.
I hand them over to you,
Right.
and you know, and it's all of a sudden that light pops on,
Right.
and they figure something out. And, you know,
Yeah.
but you can't. And I'll phrase it different than she did, because I said you can't give up in that scenario.
Right.
You have to keep pressing forward and knowing that
But you can't push it.
you can't push it
the way
can't-
you want
can't
it.
make it
Right,
happen.
you can't
Right.
force
Oh,
anybody to
absolutely
come to
not.
God and all that, so
No, no.
in either case, it's still a level of patience that
Mhm.
that is
Mhm.
being perfected, which is just
Right.
kind of interesting. He says, let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire. Kind of reflects on what you said. You just kind of gave up on it in a sense and just found yourself.
Yeah, I
And
didn't
focused
give up
on-
on my faith or anything.
Right.
I just gave up on that.
Right, one specific thing.
Hope. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she focused on God and reading her Bible and
And going
putting
to the
on
gym
that.
and all that.
And going, yeah, finding other outlets that are more, you know, constructive
Productive.
instead of destructive. And it says that when you do this, you're wanting nothing. That's pretty powerful word or phrase, that we can come to a place where we're just content with where we are being patient, waiting on God, but also trusting in Him in faith that He's going to work things out. That's a hard place to fall
It's a
into.
very hard place.
Especially depending on the sensitivity of whatever it is we're talking about. But those are the reasons that these trials and these temptations exist, is to get us to a place where we are just fully relying on God like we never have before. So that's kind of the mindset of James. That's why I say I kind of wonder what his background is and his thought process leading up to this letter, because he writes a lot about this perfect peace and this patience and this, I don't care what happens, I'm living for God. I'm demonstrating that in my life. And if you say you're a believer, then you need to show it. He goes on to say, if any of you lack wisdom, which is usually what we struggle with, wisdom in how to handle a situation, wisdom in what to do, wisdom in just anything in general. If you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, which means doesn't stir up, chaos in the mind or in someone's life, and it shall be given him. So if we lack wisdom in anything, and the young people especially, you guys are going to be facing marriage ideas at some point, college, friends you choose, friends you don't choose, the career, which direction you're going to go. We all look to that. And when we're older, we're like, retirement, we're worried about our kids, and y'all are a little ahead of me with that, but these guys will be there soon enough. And there's just a lot of things at different phases in your life where you're going to be seeking out wisdom and looking for something. He says, if you lack it, let him ask of God. And that's sadly sometimes the last place we go to. We'll start asking each other, what do you do? What do you think about that? How did you handle this? And it's good to help one another, and I think there's a place for that. But a lot of people only go to that level.
But
instead of going to God, show me who to go to ask the questions.
Try to go to people that you view as godly.
Exactly. That's the biggest thing.
You can get a lot of advice out there.
Absolutely.
Everybody has an opinion on something.
Yes, you are exactly correct. So let him ask of God, who gives to all men liberally, and it shall be given him. And this is a challenge here. And I've wrestled with this verse throughout my life on different levels. He says, but let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea driven with the wind and tossed. For let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. So let's look at that. Let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. What do we make of that phraseology there?
I take it as asking confidence that you'll receive it.
Asking, was it Jesus, I think, said, you have not because you ask not?
Or the faith of a mustard seed.
Or the faith of a mustard seed. A mountain will be removed, and all these sorts of things. I don't know. I've struggled with that throughout my life about what to ask for, when to ask it. Should I ask God for this certain thing? And people, Faith, of course she's 8, but we were at a little STEM night the other night. I love to do the science, technology, engineering, math, doing some activities, and she wanted to win this underwater video camera that they were giving away in a raffle. She's like, I really want that camera. Why don't you start praying that God will let me win that camera? And stuff like that. But at some points, even in our adult life, we may ask for something like that. God, let me have this house, or let me have this job, or let me. But James even gets to the point that says, do not even say things of that nature, but according to God's will is what we should be most concerned with.
Even going through what we've gone through with Karen,
right,
and praying for her, it's hard. And you try to always say that in God,
right,
if it's your will, but
in some moments you're so desperate, you're just like, God, let this happen, please.
Or let her have a restful night.
Right. Yeah,
It's hard to say.
And there's
That's
where the
not in His
pace-
will.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. Because we're not sure what his will is sometimes.
Right. It's tough.
Anyway, Jesus prayed, "Not my will, but your be done," and he went to the cross.
Yeah.
That was God's will for Jesus. That's tough to deal with. And not to say we're all going to face that gruesome of a future, but I mean, all the disciples were killed eventually.
Yeah.
Except for John, he died of old age. But even they attempted to kill him by boiling him in oil. And all these sorts of this is, like I said, this is a very difficult book
Yeah.
because it challenges us on so many levels. But again, he says, "Let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth," like if we say, God, I'd really like to have this job or this situation, but we'll see. Well, if we ask without having confidence in it, James says, "For let not this man think that he shall receive anything of God." So we have to have confidence, but I struggle with being overly confident with things that I ask because I wonder is that really your will for me?
Right.
Is this just something I'm wanting? Which I think is where it goes back to the patience of wanting nothing, of just trying to be content with where God has placed you and watching His blessings unfold, whether it lines up with your goals or not, kind of thing. It's just a weird place to kind of fall into with
Okay,
this
so
passage.
we want to see the church grow.
Right.
In our mind, that's
In our mind, it's God's will that the church grows.
yeah.
But what's the definition of growth? As a pastor, I kind of see, growth can really, for a church, I'll use my former church in Lane Street, North Carolina. For that church, growth for me would have been the people already there coming to know God on a deeper level than ever before. That is growth.
Okay.
Because in many cases, because I saw some of the churches in North Carolina who the few who were there, who weren't very solid in their relationship with God, even though they saw numerical growth as different opinions, different lifestyles, different backgrounds of people came in, the ones who were there before were so immature in their faith that they started fighting over, you're not even supposed to be here, you're a drug addict, or you did this, or you did that. And it turned into that, and the church just completely fell apart. And if you don't have a stable foundation of faith and maturity, as people start to come in, and God finally opens the floodgates, and you've got all of a sudden you're quadruple your congregation, if nobody is spiritually mature enough to handle the discrepancies in people's viewpoints and opinions, then that can turn into a chaos situation. Whereas if you can focus on fewer numbers and deeper roots in their faith foundation, then as the church begins to grow, you'll have a more solid, biblically based church instead of, we got all these people coming in, all this fun stuff going on, and we lose sight of God in the whole process. So from a pastor's perspective, I think you have to look at defining growth in an appropriate way for the group of people that's sitting there before you. And that's
I can see that.
Yeah.
But you can also want to touch additional lives.
Oh, absolutely, and you need to.
Yeah, and
But it goes back to
then we try to solve it ourselves.
Right.
What's
What's
the
another
latest
church
gimmick?
doing?
Yeah. Or
What is this church doing? What's this church doing? Just because it's working for that church doesn't mean it's going to work for our church.
Right.
And then there's the element of, if God can't trust you with something small, don't think He can trust you with something bigger. Those who are faithful in the small things will be trusted with the bigger things. There's all kinds of variables to consider. But yeah, a lot of people, and me included, I've fallen into, look at what this church is doing, and see all the growth that they're having. Well, maybe the people that they had there in their core leadership group was mature enough to be able to direct the people coming in. And maybe the church that you're at isn't there yet. And maybe that's why God hasn't opened up the gates yet to bring people in. Maybe there's some leadership issues. Maybe there's some spiritual issues. Maybe there's some issues that nobody's even aware of yet in people's lives that...
So pray for discernment.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the biggest thing. But it's tough, because you get frustrated, you want to see the church grow, you want to see people come back, we've talked about that.
Yeah.
We saw people come back during Karen's service, and we're like, man, that'd be cool to see those people come back.
Exactly.
You want to see new people come in, but it's got to be God's plan. It's got to be wrapped around what His, and I always try to ask myself, well, why isn't this happening? Is it me? I mean, that's really where the question should come back to. Is it me? Am I not ready? Is this person not ready? Is this group of people not ready? What's the reason? Because all these other churches, some churches are blowing up, growing like crazy. And then he gets questioning, well, why isn't ours? Why are people leaving? Why aren't any new people coming? You got a lot of questions that come up. But we got to keep our focus on God. And he gets to this point in verse 8, which is my little picture back here on our little screen for the day, is a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. In what ways can we be double-minded in our lives today? I see a lot of that going on, but what do y'all think?
Double-minded makes me think of like when I was in high school, like my dad was pastor. I was very religiously oriented and tried to keep my faith, but my friends
Right.
in high school were kind of steering me towards the worldly, like music and
Right.
fashion, blah blah blah, and I kind of felt double-minded, or like one foot was on this side, one
Mhm.
foot was on this side. I was just treading a
Meaning
really
both was important to you? Is that what you're saying?
not important, like the
Well, I mean,
worldly
at that
wasn't
age,
at that
yes,
age,
I would say so.
because I was trying to fit in.
Well, I think what was more important, since I lived through that too, is just the approval of your friends.
Yeah, but I
And
also
because you wanted
to-
them to accept you and your Christian viewpoint, you
Okay.
tended to maybe open up the gate to accepting some of what they were doing through music or actors or whatever, and connect on that level, and thus you have a foot on both fields, and you're like,
I was treading a very unbalanced.
yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of people do that. They'll,
Oh, absolutely,
And
absolutely.
like I said, I mentioned a pastor I knew who he was so far in that mindset that he opened up his house to drinking parties, to invite people from the world that he knew who were drinkers to come over and hang out with the preacher of the church in a non-church setting, just to connect with them, to invite them to come to church. Well, the end result of that is he lost his church, he lost his wife, they got divorced,
Sure.
lost his job. He was actually a news anchor on a news station, TV news station over there, and he got fired from it. And his whole life fell apart because he was extremely double-minded in his way of thinking.
So, somebody that goes to a church looking for gain, as in being around the right people or to help their career and things like that, would that be considered double-minded?
Well, if you're not there for the right reason, that could fall into that, yeah. We had a pastor two pastors before me at Lane Street in North Carolina, and he was only there for the money. I mean, he came down, eventually just admitted it to me. He was like, this is the only church, I could find that would pay this level of salary, so I'm just going to keep taking the salary until they're broke, and then I'll go somewhere else. I mean, that's literally what he told me. And he was there for the complete, and that church obviously fell apart. I mean, there was nothing good came out of his ministry being there. He lost his marriage, lost his kids. At least one of his kids turned homosexual in the process of it. He ended up remarrying, moving on to another state, and who knows what he's doing at this point. I don't know.
The reason I asked that was, if you look in Johnson City, there's about 3 or 4 that, if you're somebody, you probably go to those churches.
Gotcha.
And that, But I don't know that that's what they're doing, but it just seems strange that it's that way.
Right.
That the wealth isn't
And
spread
one of
around.
those church has actually split off into other areas 3 times.
Well, that could be growth, though.
But
I
it
mean,
is
you just don't
growth.
know, yeah.
Yeah, but it's, I mean, this could hit on a lot of different levels. One of the most obvious ones I see are these affirming churches that are popping up all over the country, of affirming, meaning they're accepting of homosexual lifestyles as being equal to heterosexual lifestyles. And they are allowing homosexuals to come in and serve in the church
Is
and
that at
become
a church
leaders.
level or a denomination?
A lot of it's denominational. I know the Methodist Church is battling with that right now. The Lutheran Church has been battling with that for years. A lot of your denominational churches, depends on the church. That's kind of a church by church basis in that situation.
So they just skip over that part
They
of
do.
the Bible?
I,
They
uh,
don't-
I'll just, online or not, I'll say it. My sister's church is called a Congregationalist church. It's out in California. Their church is actually used in movies for church scenes and stuff, so they're a pretty, affiliated with the industry kind of stuff out there. And they have an openly gay choir director, they have a woman pastor, they do same-sex marriages and everything. And I asked her, like, how do you justify that? Like, the Bible's extremely clear on the topic. Said, well, we just, we want people to feel welcome and accepted. So they're more worried about the way the people feel than how God feels. And that's just been her answer.
If you do that to get them in and then, maybe, I don't know.
I mean, I've said it for years. I'm perfectly okay with gay people coming to church at the church that I am a leader in, to come and listen and to hear the messages, to hear the gospel, and to let it then settle in and transform their lives, to allow them to become born again so they can change and line up with the Bible. I'm perfectly okay with any sinful person, because we're all sinful on some level, but some are more open than others. But I'm perfectly okay with them being a part of sitting in the congregation, but that I would not let them join the church until they demonstrate that they're a born again believer. And if you're a born again believer, verses and passages like this and many others very plainly say, if you claim to be a Christian, you're going to have to live like one to show evidence that your testimony is lining up with the Word of God. And I just don't see that there's any place in allowing that, even, and we've dealt with that here since I've been here. People who are heterosexual and living together without being married.
Right.
We had a young lady wanting to come join the church, and she was denied, and she's just dropped out of church again, not going to church anywhere, which was my fear. But she was openly, and it still is, living openly outside of the bonds of marriage with a guy. They're committed. They're only with each other. It's like they're married, but they just refuse to get married for some reason. And that person was denied membership here at this church, and caused some trouble for the young lady. I mean, but at the same time, I would, if I was in that position to sit down with her, I'd be like, well, why don't you just get married?
Right.
If that's literally the only thing keeping you from having a biblically correct relationship, just get married. There's some reason they're not getting married, and I don't know what that reason is. But that within itself, I would not want that person to come in and be leading in any shape, form, or fashion, because they're leading by wrong example. And I think that's why there is a high expectation of pastors and leaders and teachers, and especially deacons and people of authority and leadership in the church, that this ought to matter. And the stuff that James was talking about, again, he was considered to be a pillar of the church according to the book of Galatians. And according to the book of Acts, he was one that people came to get suggestions and advice and direction and all that. So being a double-minded person, as he says, a double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways. We don't want an unstable church. We don't need an unstable home environment. We see enough of that as it is. You know, I see kids every day. I dealt with one this Friday whose his home life is just not together at all. And the parents are like, we don't know why he's acting the way he's acting. Well, it's probably because y'all are acting the way you're acting. You know, and he's seeking attention, and he's caught somewhere in the middle. And when you have an unstable situation because of double-mindedness, it just never ends in anything positive.
That reminds me of somebody in our family who, on mom's side, who is not actively in church, and their daughter is, as soon as she graduates high school, wanting to move in with some guy.
Yeah.
And not.
And they're okay with it.
Because they're not in church, they're not actively, the parents are actively living out the Bible, so the kids don't have an example to live by, and that's what's causing them to make
The kids are never made, I mean, if you want to say it that way, made to go to church. They weren't even encouraged to go to church. And the parents don't go to church. Therefore, it's kind of what you can expect. When you don't have a standard and you're not giving the example that you should be, not to say that any of us are the perfect example, but there's a lot of really terrible examples out there that, you know, we have these kids, you know, my wife had this one kid come in, I don't even know the name, probably shouldn't mention it anyway, but a little boy, fingernail polish, long hair, and the parents were like, oh, he's just a free spirit, and he's just this, and he's just that, and we encourage him to be his own person, and all this sort. Yeah, yeah, we see it.
It's almost like we have to parent the parents
exactly.
because they were not brought up right in the beginning.
Yeah. Well, that's what we've run into. I think we've talked about that. Is we're now at a third generation away from ours, where we were born and raised and grew up in church. But a lot of my friends personally, they dropped out of church or never went to church. They didn't have that foundation even at my age. Their kids certainly don't have the foundation because they never took them to church. And now those kids are some of the kids we're seeing in the school system. So we're like,
the astrology and cat ears.
yeah, it's just like compounding, and we're seeing worse and worse parenting. And it's not biblically based at all, and it's just causing all kinds of crazy
it's a very
chaos.
Do what you want to do culture.
It is.
Nowadays.
Just live for yourself, please yourself.
And when the veterans wore dresses, that's the first time I've ever seen the dress.
Wow.
We've seen the crop tops and
Right.
spaghetti strap tops and things like that.
But never a dress.
Never a dress.
Hmm.
So that was my first. We can't say anything.
Right, you're not supposed to say anything about it. It's getting frustrating for me as an educator to stand by and just openly embrace a lie and encourage it and accept it or whatever. But I don't know. We'll see how all that.
The worst part is, you know, Thomas, right?
Yeah.
So his parents, well, his mom, never been to church, and she's living with this guy that they met. They dated for like a month maybe and got married.
Yeah.
They're having problems, and Thomas is, since neither of them have ever been in a church, he's confused and has no idea what's going on.
Right.
He doesn't even know what's after death. I was talking to him last night. I don't know what came up. He was, I sent him a video about how, like, it was, what's that guy you were watching?
Ray.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Ray
sent him that
Comfort.
video, and he was like, he had no clue what was after death, and he just seemed confused, had no clue
Yeah.
what to think.
And that's just so many people. They just don't even, they haven't been taught, so they don't have a clue, and they're just completely confused and dumbfounded at even where to begin in knowing what the standard is for living, for dying, what's going to happen after that. That's my whole thing for I've said this for 20 years now. We're setting these kids up by giving them so many excuses to act the way they act that, you know, we've heard the phrase entitlement now for 10 to 15 years. We're just setting these kids up to go to hell, because they're going to think, if they think about it at all, well, if I die, I go to heaven because I'm such a good person. Everybody's always told me that all my life, and God's just He's going to let me in. Why wouldn't he? And they've created a false image of God, which is violating commandment 1 and 2 of having no idols and serving the only one and true God. And we're setting these people up for thinking they can just be themselves and still go to heaven if they're even wrapped around that mindset at all. And we're setting them up for failure eternally. And I've said that to my peers in public education for years, and they all kind of roll their eyes at me. Like, and then some of them where I work now are on board with it, and we all kind of work together to try to legally, make an impact where we can. But it's sad, and that's what we're seeing on the news now. These generation gaps have happened, and now we're seeing, 10, 11, 9, 10, 11-year-olds making the decision for transition surgeries and doing things that are permanently going to disable their bodies from being a normal person the rest of their life. And their teachers are encouraging it, the government's encouraging it, the government's offering to pay for it. It's just, do what? Celebrities are pushing it. Yeah, it's just, we saw even on the Grammys, I didn't watch it, but I caught the aftermath of Sam Smith.
Oh, I did too. I saw that.
And
I didn't see it. A girl at work said he did.
yeah, one of their his big new songs is called Unholy. And he dressed up like the devil. He had a devil hat and horns on, dressed in red, and they danced around, did all this crazy stuff. And of course, he's identifying as non-binary now. Like 2 or 3 years ago, he came out as being gay. Everybody's like, okay, yeah, that's not unexpected, not shocking. And then he claimed to be gender fluid, which meant one day he can be one and the next day he can be another.
No way.
Yeah. And now he's claiming to be non-binary, which means he's neither male nor female. But yeah, he's had no surgeries. He's taken no medical intervention with hormones or anything. He's just saying these things. And his music is what's flooding TikTok and what's flooding the music industry. And all these young, impressionable kids are listening to this and looking to him as their example.
The sad part about it is, and we saw an interview with him on the news, is that he was bullied as a kid. This short little fat kid that got bullied in school. In my opinion, all that is a cry out for help.
Absolutely.
He does not know who he is.
Yeah.
He does not know his creator. He's crying out.
And now he's mocking
Yeah.
the whole story of the Bible by dressing up as Satan.
Exactly.
Because you were talking about that. Somebody at your school said they were into Satanism, but they didn't believe in Satan, which is a LaVeyan Satanism thing that started in the 60s with Anton LaVey. He's the guy that started the Satanic Church and wrote the Satanic Bible, and that's what flooded the movies in the 80s and 90s, was his form of Satanism. And he's like, well, Satan chose himself, therefore he's our poster child, because we live for ourselves. And that's why we call ourselves Satanists, even though we don't believe in God or Satan. And that's ramping back up in our culture today. It's coming back. And as a Beyonce, she does full on that. They have a pentagram thing laid out on the stage of their candles, and they dance in all these satanic ways. She even uses a stage name and says when she gets on stage, it's like something takes over her and she becomes another person. I'm like, yeah, that's called a demon. But this is becoming full force again back into our culture for the young people. And that's really all this transgenderism and stuff is live for yourself, do what makes you feel good about who you are. That's what the devil did.
It's easier for him to get to young people
Yeah.
who do not have a knowledge.
Because they don't know.
Because the young people have not had the foundation that we had. And that's where we're at.
And that's the
in our
only thing
community.
you have to fight with is
Yeah.
your knowledge and your prayer and your belief in God.
Right. So I appreciate what Zachary's doing. I've introduced him to Ray Comfort and a lot of his
Yeah.
videos and how he goes out and witnesses and all that. And now he's sharing it with his buddies, and that's what we're going to have to do is try to just plant those seeds and be as proactive as we
The
can.
sad part about it is there's so much going on in this world with like all this evil happening, and Thomas is just, he doesn't know where to look because he doesn't know what to believe or
Right.
where to start. And he almost seemed like not only confused but scared at the same time because he was like,
Well, he's
never
probably
thought
come to the
about it.
realization that, God is real and this stuff is real, and my mom and dad are so far away
Well,
from him
I
that
kinda-
that's why they are the way they are.
I kind of, cause I've told him about it before, but like with the moon rusting, is they've discovered like the moon has started to rust,
Yeah.
which in Revelation it said,
About the moon turning to blood, being red.
which
They
is
have-
what they believe
Yeah.
the moon will rust. And he was like, "Oh, it's just a coincidence." And then I was like, "The Euphrates is drying up, and they're finding caves under it." Told him about in Revelations. It said he's trying to pin it on it's all
It's all
coincidental.
coincidental.
And the
Yeah.
difference in the seasons, like you would not be able to tell the difference in
Right.
the seasons. Well, it's gonna be 70, it was 70 last week.
That is
It's gonna be
true.
70
We're
today.
seeing the
We've
signs
never
all
had this
around
since
us.
February.
And
Yeah.
most people just want to believe it's a coincidence, and
Climate change.
Yeah.
that's what it is now. They're trying
Yeah.
to come up with excuses
But there's so
for.
many coincidences, though. It's like, how is there
It's
that
impossible
many
for there to be that many
And
coincidences.
that's what I pointed out to him. I'm like, with all these things that it says in the Bible, how is it all coincidental?
Yeah,
And he's just like,
has no answer.
so you just
Mhm.
gotta pray for him, basically.
So that's a good summation of where we stopped in verse 8 of a double-minded man is unstable in all his way. That's what we're seeing in our society today. So we'll stop there for the folks online. We'll pick up with verse 9 next week. And actually, I won't be here next week. I'm going to be at another church just preaching, presenting my books. So the week after, when we come back, we'll pick up with verse 9. So we'll see you guys then. Y'all have a good week.